Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On this episode, we're asking a trick question that's probably taken straight from the top of the Notes app on Vladimir Putin's iPad. Is Ukraine losing the war? It's the kind of query that might ruin an otherwise good dinner party discussion, but here we are because apparently we really like an awkward conversation. Now, you might say, wait, we've heard so much about Ukraine's resilient defense, its unwavering spirit, its citizens turning rusted tractors into the biggest threats to Russian tanks. How can we even raise the possibility that they're losing? Well, great point, but in this episode, we're taking stock of the current battlefield momentum, and it's not rosy. Here's a look at our latest report.
If one were to think that all the talk about negotiations has cooled the war in Ukraine, they'd be wrong. While politicians meet, discuss and engage in a war of words, clashes with real weapons are taking place across the Ukrainian front. Recent Russian strikes have targeted Mykolaiv and Sumy. Dozens of buildings have been damaged and several people have been wounded. The day of these attacks isn't a coincidence either, because this happened on Ukraine's Unity Day.
All of us who were born in different cities, towns and villages, all of our soldiers, our children, doctors, volunteers, teachers, power engineers, everyone who today, wherever they are, will say, I am a Ukrainian, I am a Ukrainian.
The situation on the front line itself is not looking great for Ukrainian forces. The Russians have been pushing towards Kharkiv and have the town of Vovchansk in their sights. The Ukrainian troops stationed in the region are keenly aware of the danger that these cities have found themselves in.
Vovchansk is not far at all from Kharkiv. The threat remains. There's constant danger in the skies.
The war isn't limited to just Ukrainian territory, however. The Ukrainian breach onto Russian soil in the Kursk region continues to hold, despite Moscow's best efforts to push them out. This part of Russia is crucial for Ukraine's prospects at any future negotiating table. It's a bargaining chip that it cannot afford to lose. Not even the aid from North Korea has done much to improve Russia's chances in retaking these lands, though Moscow has enough resources to fight both here and in Ukraine itself. Experts say that the war is most likely entering a decisive stage. What both sides hold on to now will have tenfold value when the time for peace talks comes.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, first off, let's talk military resources. Ukraine's forces have put up a formidable fight. They've frustrated Russian offenses, recaptured territory, and proven that stealthy tactics and modern weapons can outmaneuver a lumbering behemoth that forgot to read the part of the script where they're supposed to be unstoppable. But these aren't Marvel superheroes with vibranium-grade plot armor. Sustained conflict drains manpower, equipment, and morale like a leaky faucet. Ukraine desperately needs continued support from Western allies, advanced weaponry, training, and intelligence. If that support wavers, either due to political shifts, budget constraints, or world leaders discovering that winning elections sometimes depends on not spending money abroad, then Ukraine's prospects could darken. Then there's Russia, and they're not exactly giving up. Sure, their initial invasion was a fiasco that even the most creative spin doctor would struggle to describe as successful, but they have the advantage of sheer size, deeper pockets, and a leadership that just doesn't care too much about whether the average Russian citizen is happy about the war. Authoritarian regimes can't just keep marching forward, often at the expense of their own soldiers, until someone physically stops them, or they trip over their own logistic nightmares, whichever comes first. So while the Kremlin has faced setbacks, it's not rolling over to say, our bad guys, and quietly head home. It's doubling down, regrouping, and gambling on the West's eventual exhaustion. Now, we also need to consider the issue of war fatigue, both in Ukraine and among its supporters. People can only handle so much bad news before they start ignoring it in favor of scrolling their social media feeds. While the global community initially rallied behind Ukraine, unity might waver if the war drags on longer than a poorly edited wedding toast. Countries struggling with their own inflation, energy crisis, and domestic politics might start to think, is this war really our problem? If that sentiment grows, Ukraine's lifeline shrinks. But let's pump the brakes on the doom and gloom express. Is Ukraine losing the war? Well, not necessarily, and certainly not right now. In fact, the question shouldn't be, is Ukraine losing the war, so much as how can Ukraine ensure it doesn't lose the war? Because the only thing worse than asking if Ukraine is losing is waking up one day to find out that it lost, and we were too busy ignoring the warning signs. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Radisław Kotin, Senior Editor from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, Benjamin. Hello.
So we are once again examining the situation in Ukraine and trying to answer the very difficult question of whether Ukraine is winning or not, because we seem to be stuck in a quite tricky situation where negotiation is on the table and we're looking at some progression from the Russian side of things. Can you first help us break down what's the actual situation on the ground?
Situation extremely difficult for Ukraine in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine because Russian troops are slowly advancing. Settlement after settlement have been taken, occupied by Russian troops slowly. But still, nevertheless, these are not strategic advances. This is kind of rather tactical gains with no huge strategical implications for Ukraine and for the war. Yes, Russia is advancing, but they remarkably failed to achieve their main strategic goal for 2024, and it was to occupy the whole Donbas, the whole Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, to control the whole, to get into the administrative borders of Luhansk and Donetsk region. They wanted to do this by the end of last year, in 2024, and they remarkably failed. So we'll see how it progresses. Meanwhile, Ukraine is trying to hold position in the south, in Kharkiv region, not allowing Russians to advance. And there were some small but nevertheless gains for Ukrainians in the Kursk region of Russian Federation, where Ukrainians have been able to conduct their operation since the beginning of August. It's already almost 6 months, for half a year. Ukrainian troops are occupying part or deployed in the part of Russian Federation. And in the future talks, it's important. Why it's important? Because it won't be exchange 1 square kilometer of Kursk region, Ukrainian control parts of Kursk region, 1 square kilometer of Russia-controlled Ukrainian region. The price of Kursk operation is much higher. The price of land which Ukrainians control in the Russian Kursk region is much, much higher than the face value per square kilometer for square kilometer. No. Its proportion should be much, much bigger. And Ukraine, that's why, is very keen to hold positions in the Kursk region.
Right, this is actually what I'm trying to get to as well, because we're also talking about the future, well, probably very near future peace negotiations, and of course both sides are trying to gain an upper hand to the negotiation table. So in your assessment, does it mean that Ukraine actually still will be in a more favorable position when it comes to what land it holds in the Kursk region as opposed to what the Russians currently control?
Yes, Ukraine wants to strengthen its negotiating position soon, and we of course know that new U.S. administration wants talks to start, and even the 100 days for peace settlement has been mentioned, this kind of deadline, 100 days, or maximum, I saw 6 months were mentioned. So we'll see, but there is this push from Washington for peace settlement in Ukraine. There is hope that this year, 2025, might become year of peace. We'll see. The thing is that Ukraine wants to strengthen its negotiating positions on several directions. First of all, by convincing Trump administration that sanctions against Russia should not be lifted, and even the strengthening of these sanctions should be on the table. Secondly, Ukraine wants to hold position in the Kursk region for future territorial exchange. Thirdly, Ukraine is striking Russian oil refineries, air bases, oil depots, which are fueling Russian war machine. Remarkably, in the last several weeks, there were massive drone and missile attacks against Russian military or energy or oil infrastructure in Russian Federation, even at the distance of 1,200 kilometers, quite far away from Ukrainian territory. That's another thing. Ukraine wants to keep NATO membership on the table for future negotiations, kind of to strengthen its position. The door to NATO, despite unwillingness on the part of Trump's team not to give Ukrainian invitation or NATO membership, but nevertheless, this question, this issue should be on the table, because possible NATO membership also strengthen Ukrainian negotiating positions. And also Ukraine is promoting idea of Western troops deployment in Ukraine, possibly European troops, French, British, even Polish were mentioned in particular, German troops, but also Zelensky in Davos said that Ukraine wants to see American troops on Ukrainian soil as a peacekeepers, as a guarantors of a future peace deal. So it's also strengthened Ukrainian positions. The very prospect of Western troops in Ukraine, the very prospect of deployment of American troops in Ukraine also strengthened Ukrainian positions vis-a-vis Russia during future talks. So all this combined are the Ukrainian efforts to strengthen its position, to make it stronger vis-a-vis Russia at the future peace talks. And we don't know what kind of format of these peace talks. Are they going to be Ukrainian-Russian talks? We don't know. Are they going to be Ukrainian-Russian-American talks under American umbrella? We don't know. Ukrainians also insist that Europe should have a voice in this future peace settlement. As one European official nicely put it, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and nothing about Ukraine without Europe. Europe should be also involved in a future peace deal and the future negotiation and future security guarantees for Ukraine.
Right. So like you mentioned, a lot of measures are put into place to strengthen Ukraine's position before going into this negotiation. And you also mentioned, Trump threatening to push more sanctions on Russia if they decide not to negotiate or not come to the table to this peace talk. But at this point, what are some of the things that still could be put under sanction that is currently not on sanction? Is that going to be something effective enough to convince the Russians to come and talk?
First of all, it's oil, because gas has been cut off. Russian gas supplies to Europe mostly was cut off already. Other sectors are hit hardly by Western sanctions. There are several remaining things. First of all, oil and oil industry, refinery, refined oil products should be sanctioned, and America could also flood with Saudi help and other partners' help, or world markets with cheap oil to reduce world oil price drastically, so Russia will be hit hardly. To sanction Russian oil energy, to put pressure on India and China not to buy cheaply Russian oil, to sanction this. It's already been under consideration, and the steps have been taken already about so-called shadow Russian fleet of tankers. Also liquidate gas supplies from Russia to Western markets. LNG gas also is not under sanctions. So there are still, ruble is falling dramatically, inflation in Russia. Even Putin acknowledged that the Russian economy is going through quite difficult. Sometimes I have an impression, to be honest, that Trump worries about Russia more and Russians more than Putin. Trump said these days that he loves Russian people. He thinks that it's appalling that young Russian soldiers are dying in Ukraine in such a huge numbers, almost like 1,000 a day, or been killed or wounded every day in Ukraine. That these losses are enormous for Russian people, or when young soldiers are dying. So because Trump, it seems like, cares more about Russia than Putin, because Putin never cares about Russian losses in Ukraine. He never mentioned them. He never mentioned that he loves Russian people, as Trump said. So it seems that Putin doesn't care, but we'll see, because the Russian economy is in poor state, and also Russian losses are significant, very significant in Ukraine, especially this year, especially in 2024 and beginning of this year.
All right, and bringing things back to the battlefield, are we looking at currently manpower shortages in the Ukrainian side, and are there any measures trying to address that?
Yes, there are several things under consideration. First of all, not to kind of there is a desire not to found new brigades in Ukraine, but rather to staff the already formed brigades in Ukraine which are lacking staff. Secondly, under consideration, the idea of bringing down the threshold for mobilization from 25 to 18 years. But, the thing is that this type of war, the war of attrition, when with so many losses, Ukraine should also think about its younger generation. They shouldn't die on a battlefield like in thousands. No. Because this country has to have a future. And who will build this bright future, prosperous future for Ukraine? It's young generation. So this type of World War I type of war of attrition, should not kind of eat young Ukrainians from age of 18. But nevertheless, Ukraine is trying to convince the Europeans to provide more military aid to Ukraine, and especially when Americans are hesitating a little bit, and we don't know what will happen under Trump administration. But it seems that military aid won't be stopped completely by Trump. Maybe there will be change that military aid will be provided as loans, not just direct aid to Ukraine. Maybe loans type of lend-lease kind of type of military aid for Ukraine. That's one thing under consideration. But generally speaking, situation is difficult, but difficult for both Ukraine and Russia. And if Russia will approach negotiation with the positions that we won't give away not a single inch of occupied Ukrainian territory, that's unrealistic approach. Because as new U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, both Ukraine and Russia should be ready for compromises. Both of them, not just Ukraine, but Russia as well.
Right, so we'll have to see how the situation develops. Meanwhile, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. U.S. President Donald Trump has warned Vladimir Putin of further consequences if he does not end the war in Ukraine immediately. Trump had previously promised to end the war as soon as he takes office.
Donald Trump has called his Russian counterpart out by name. In a social media post, the American president threatened Putin with further sanctions and high tariffs should he not end the war in Ukraine, which Trump called, to quote, ridiculous. Trump also wrote that he would impose sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and, to quote, various other participating countries. What's more, Trump also spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping via phone and urged him to help end the conflict. For now, the new US president has not revealed what exactly these new sanction measures would entail. They would add to an already long list of economic measures affecting Russia for its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. On several occasions, Trump has said he would like to speak with both President Zelensky and Putin in a bid to end the war. He also claimed that Zelensky in particular had told him that he wanted a peace settlement to end the conflict.
It's an honor to...
A new survey shows that a fifth of Ukrainians would move abroad if travel restrictions were lifted. The male and youth demographics would be the most likely to leave in comparison to other groups.
A recent survey by the Ilka Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation and the Razumkov Center says that around 21% of Ukrainians would move abroad if all travel restrictions were lifted by authorities. Currently, men aged between 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine unless it is under very specific circumstances. This situation has been in effect since the declaration of martial law across the country in the wake of the Russian full-scale invasion. Should borders be reopened for all Ukrainian citizens, however, around 70% would opt to remain in the country. 21% said they are ready to leave Ukraine and reside abroad permanently. 25% of men and 31% of young people declared that they would want to move abroad. Only around 9% of people aged 60 and above said they were willing to move abroad. There are currently around 4.2 million Ukrainian refugees residing in the European Union under temporary protection status. The largest number live in Germany and Poland.
Syria has terminated Russia's 49-year control of the strategic Mediterranean Tartus port. The base was one of the main locations from which Moscow propped up the Assad regime with military equipment.
The new Syrian government has ended the investment agreement which gave Russia control over the port. This marks a dramatic shift in the military and economic partnership between the two countries, which has been ongoing for decades. This decision also strikes a heavy blow to Russia's naval capabilities in both the region and in its war in Ukraine. The base was Russia's only naval maintenance and resupply point in the Mediterranean Sea and served that purpose since the 1970s. It eliminated the need for Russian ships to return to Black Sea ports. The lack of the Tartus port not only hinders Russian ambitions and designs in the Middle East, but also those for North Africa. Russia's ability to logistically support its military and private military contractors in Africa will now be severely limited. UK military intelligence says that Moscow currently has no comparable alternatives in the region. Russia is currently evacuating equipment from the base. Reports indicate that it is being sent either to friendly bases in North Africa or back to Russia itself.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.